This video is on culture and is a context for my courses on culture. And why do I teach a course on culture? Well, one reason is that at Keio University, a lot of my students come from 30, 40 different nations. And they're outside Japan people studying in Japan. Similarly, a lot of my Japanese students at Keio either have exchange programs abroad or intend to have exchange programs abroad. And then I myself am an American working in Japan and working in China. And but more than that, the profession of my department, systems is one profession, management is another profession, and design is another profession. Systems design and management is the name of the department. Those three professions all involve multicultural customer chains, multicultural supply chains, and I've got to now start talking about how to think clearly about culture. And the very, very first point of clarification just came up in that last statement I made. Do you know what it is? It's the idea, the default idea, that multicultural means multi-nation. Now, it's true that multicultural includes cultures of various nations, but that's not the most powerful, the most important, and the most common form of multiculturalness that we have to deal with. The most powerful and common form is multiple professions, with each profession having a very different and distinct culture. And there's a somewhat of a hierarchy among these professions, where some of the professions are trained in graduate school to bow down before other professions, and other professions are trained in graduate school to control and manipulate and order around other professions. So the fact that to get anything done in the modern enterprise, you have to combine sales and marketing, design, manufacturing, product design, service, and outside legal, inside legal, and outside R&D idea sources and inside R&D sources. You have to deal with multiple organization cultures, multiple profession cultures, multiple genders, increasingly in parts of the world outside of Asia, where you have multiple genders allowed. In Asia, they don't allow women for the most part. That's the first point of thinking clearly about culture, is getting out of your head this constant, foolish, default, dumb, out-of-date idea that multicultures means multinational culture, and that culture is referring to national culture. No, that is rarer and less common and less important than the different cultures of professions that cause large corporations to fail. Yeah, let me give you an example. Inside of Japan, we had a company called Sharp Electronics Company, Hayakawa Denki. I happen to know the Hayakawa family, so I know the old history of the firm personally. And so this firm, Sharp, had a thing called Zaris, a personal digital assistant, it was called, in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And they lost a third and then half of their global market share to a thing called the Palm Pilot in the early 1990s. And the most striking thing was that at the time where they lost suddenly their market share worldwide, the Zaris had over 100 buttons on it. And the competition that was putting it out of business, the Palm Pilot, had 5 buttons. And the question, the cultural question is, what is it about the culture of Japanese traditional management that causes them to grow more and more buttons? Now, the reason I mention that is the TV industry worldwide has for a long time been dominated by Japan, although now it's dominated by Korea. But it used to be for 20 years dominated by Japan. Richard Nixon sort of gave the American Motorola Zenith TV industry to Japan in a sort of political deal a few decades ago. And the TV industry was a large source of money for consumer electronics companies in Japan. And we all suffer from 3 or 4 clicky poos needed to control our TV. God help you if you press the wrong button, because it'll take you a week to go find your programs again. This is also Japanese design. And they've been doing it. They've had 3 or 4 clicky poos now for 20 years and not fixed the problem. And nobody in Japan has come up with a 5-button solution to that. Now, why? What is it about Japanese traditional management that causes them to tend toward too many buttons? What is it about the culture of Japanese management that causes them to do this? Think about it. It's a powerful effect. It's extremely irritating to customers, and it makes Japanese companies extremely liable to Korean and American competition. So it's a great business failure. It continues for decades, so the Japanese are helpless to fix it on their own. They can't notice it. They can't fix it. It's a cultural thing. What is it about Japanese management that makes too many buttons? It's the political weakness of Japan as a culture, their inability to reach agreement with each other. Isn't that interesting? Because the Japanese have this image of themselves as great at reaching agreement with each other by harage and ishin dinshin and not using words and not having contracts like Americans. But in fact, the excess buttons on Japanese products of every sort and the commercial failure of these products whenever a foreign competitor reduces 100 buttons to 5 buttons demonstrates that they are unable to get committees of engineers for each subsystem of Bazaris at a different committee of engineers. And each committee of engineers had their own buttons they proposed. And rather than do the hard political work of making people do trade-offs with each other and everybody agreeing on 5 buttons, it was just easier to be harage and friendly and close emotionally and let everybody have some buttons. And only the customer suffered, and then only the company suffered when competition ran it out of business. So it's more politically easier in Japanese traditional management culture to destroy the company than it is to serve the customer and take 100 buttons and knock it down to 5 buttons. So this is an example of the commercial danger of falling in love with yourself and worshiping your own culture. And Japan worships their own culture, and like America worships their own culture. And that always is a sign of weak men. Strong men do not worship their own culture. Weak men worship themselves. And actually, it's a form of mental illness. It's called narcissism. But you get away with it in business because a lot of businessmen don't read psychology and don't know a lot about therapy, and so they treat each other in these psychologically damaging ways. And because nobody studies anything except business or economics, they get away with it until it ruins the company. Now, Palm came along and ruined the Zaris' market worldwide with 5 buttons. And they were able to politically force subsystem teams to cooperate on one interface. But it took suffering, real emotional suffering, and engineers lost many of those battles. Most engineers lost most of those battles because every engineer had their own preferred form of button. And most of the engineers on most of the subsystem teams didn't get what they wanted. And they had to compromise and use somebody else's button and interface arrangement. And traditional Japanese management culture is very politically weak at reaching agreement, even though they're self-image. Now, this is the second reason why it's hard to think clearly about culture. What is it? I've just introduced now for 5 minutes the second reason why it's so hard to think clearly and professionally about culture. What did I just mention the last 5 minutes? And it's got nothing to do with Japan. That was the example. It's the principle I'm interested in here. The principle is what? That everybody has a culture and everybody has a theory of what their culture is. And the theory they have of their culture is often not accurate as a rendition or representation of what their actual behavior is. So if you look at how they think and act in behavioral terms, and you count kinds of reactions and kinds of situations very carefully, you'll find that the actual culture of people is very different than their theory about what their culture is. Let me give you an American example. I walked using my suit designs on the beaches of Hawaii, and various American men would spit on me. Spit on me, a sign of enormous hatred and disrespect, even though they're strangers, because elegant clothes that differed from the American look, the sort of Gap look of really cheap-looking clothes, make them feel intensely uncomfortable. And Americans' culture has a theory about their culture that they're very tolerant and welcoming of differences. That's their theory about themselves. But when you actually test it in behavioral terms, America is one of the least tolerant cultures of differences in the world. Isn't that interesting? The theory is the exact, it's not so different than advertising. What airplane company has advertisements telling you that they're clean? Their planes are so clean and beautiful. It's the airplane company that did a customer survey that showed that customers thought airplanes were dirty. So they create an ad campaign to create an image that their planes are clean. It's a lie. Of course, if you just listen to the ad, reverse the ad, and you get what the questionnaire results were about reality. So the airplane that advertises that they're on time, what are they? They are the airplane that's always late. And the airplane that advertises that they serve a lot of cities, what does that mean? It means they're the airplane that serves less cities than the other airplanes. So the same way you can take the theory people have about their culture and often, not always, but often reverse it to get the reality. And the natives will have no idea. They will have not a clue. They, all their life, they've been brainwashed that we are these kind of people, and they've heard it so many times they never thought about it, because if they heard it in elementary school, governments sell the nation so you'll pay taxes. And so everybody repeats this blindly without ever having thought or examined it or looked at any data. But that's what professors do around the world. Nisbet and Matsumoto and the University of Michigan tested these ideas about the American theory of American culture versus the actuality of American culture, the Japanese theory of Japanese culture versus the reality of Japanese culture, the Korean theory of Korean culture versus the actuality of Korean culture, and they found enormous gaps, roughly gaps as big as the gaps between what an advertisement says and the reality of the company that paid for the advertisement. So that's the second reason that it's difficult to think professionally and clearly about culture, because we have to distinguish the theory people have of what their culture is and then how they actually behave, which are quite different. Then there's a third reason why it's hard to think difference about professionally about culture, and that is that culture seems to be everything everywhere that everyone has ever done. That's pretty big. So you're talking about culture, the word represents everything that's human. And so you say culture does this, culture is like that, and so the subject of that sentence is everything that humans are and be and do is this, everything that humans are and be and do is that. And you can see how a few sentences like that in a row, and you're just talking gobbledygook. There's no, the subject of the sentence is so huge and what you're saying is so focused that within a couple of three sentences, everybody who uses the word culture for three sentences in a row, by the time they get to the third sentence, what they mean is nothing. It's just chaos. And so it's very hard to just use language to talk clearly about culture, because the subject, the word culture, represents everything that humans being do. Everything that humans do is culture. Not only that, but culture is invisible. We don't know our own selves. We don't know I'm American. I don't know what Americannesses are inside of me. I know some of them, but I don't know all of them, because I learned Americanness for 20 years between 0 years old and 20 years old, growing up. And I observed more than I was verbally explained. And so most of what I learned, I never had words for at all. And then my mother taught me a lot of things. She said, the right way to tie shoes is this way, and the right way to greet strangers is that way, and the right way to paint a house is this way. And she never explained that those weren't really right ways. They were just ways that she knew, and her friends and everybody she knows does it that way. There's nothing right about it. It's just how we do it around here. And she didn't bother teaching me as a kid all the alternative ways to do that around the world. And so I grew up thinking that the way I do everything is right, and therefore if you don't do it my way, you're inferior or wrong. And we all grow up that way. Our mothers do that to us by not saying, here's the way in the East Coast of the United States in the 20th century that we tie shoes, but 200 years ago on the East Coast, we were more British and we tied shoes in a different way. And if you were in America, on California 50 years ago, you tied shoes in a different way. No, mothers don't have time to do all that. And so we grow up with one way to do everything, unconsciously learn, and we assume it's right. There's a third problem. The ways we learned, however bad they are, or limited they are, or bigoted they are, or out of date they are, the ways we learned the ways that we learned to do everything are, how do I say, this is a difficult point to make. Not only are they everything we do in such ways, and not only are they invisible ways that we don't always know what the ways we learned are, and we didn't learn the alternative ways to the ways we learned. Not only that, but the ways that we do things are effortless, automatic, easy. And even if they're no good, it's so much easier for me to do it the way I was trained as a kid. That's effortless. I practiced it 1 billion times. So if I have a choice and limited energy and attention, I will react in my old pattern unconscious way simply because it's effortless, even if it's worse. And so there's a kind of bribe, a low energy, low attention, low mental consciousness bribe for always doing things the old ways we were trained as a kid. And therefore, any new ways or better ways require conscious effort and deliberate rehearsal and effort and attention. And they're just a giant pain to do. And there's so much more effort to do. And if I have the choice, why not just do it the old way that's instant and automatic? And so this giant bribe is constantly pulling all of us back to 0 to 20, 0 to 20, 0 to 20. And that's why you find so many people with 50-year-old bodies and 20-year-old minds. Their bodies age, but their minds, by that bribe, keep being bribed to doing everything the way their mommy taught them. And then, eventually they tell lies to themselves. They say that, the way my mommy taught me really is best. And, the society I was born in really is best, and the language I learned really is best, and the food I eat really is best, and the way I talk to friends really is best, and the kind of art I do is really best, and the mountains in my country really are the best in the world. And, everybody in the world thinks that they happen to be born in the best place in the world. Now, what that means is, when they're using the word best there, if you think professionally, the word best there means no effort and no attention and no consciousness required to do things my way. That's all the word best means. It doesn't mean best in any serious or science or comparative sense at all. They don't even know how most of the people in the world do these things. They don't even know mountains in Afghanistan. They don't even know how everything else in the world looks and acts and folks. They've never even been to most of those places. They don't even know the names of most of those places. But they think their thing is best. What they mean by that is, I am too lazy to consciously change how I do things. That's what the word best means. The word best means I'm too lazy to change the way I do things. I would rather be a child all of my life, operate the ways put in me by my mommy, and I'll just do that in a 50-year-old body, a 60-year-old body, a 70-year-old body all of my life. And that's easier than stopping the habits my mommy gave me and deliberately practicing new habits that are better from the other places in the world until they become as automatic and effortless as the ways my mommy taught me. So this is why, this is not all, but this is some of the reasons why it's hard for us to think about culture professionally and deal with it professionally. And then this is also why culture makes fools of the world's greatest leaders and the world's smartest people from the best colleges. And so you have these great people with 800 GREs and graduate degrees from top 10 colleges in America and wonderful companies they work for, global companies in different countries of the world, and they lose billions and billions of dollars in a 3-year project, 5-year project, because they make parking spaces the size of American cars in France, and they order French employees not to have mustaches and not to drink wine, so the French go outside and drink wine somewhere else for lunch because we ordered them not to drink wine. Because in America, we don't drink wine, and we moved our business to France, and we did the American thing there, and French people like wine for lunch. And so culture has the power to make fools of the world's smartest people. And then you have to think about how we educate the world's smartest people so that almost all of them everywhere, one way or another, make fools of themselves and lose $1 billion here, $1 billion there because of culture factors. Are we somehow failing fundamentally to acknowledge something about our elite, our best people, so that they never learn to face culture and handle it professionally? And so, one critique that this course implicitly makes to all the universities in the world except where I am now, KO, is that most universities do not have courses about handling culture that are mainstream, that all the people in engineering, that all the people in business, that all the people in MBA programs, all the people in public administration, all the people in this, that, and the other have to take. And therefore, they are subject to being made fools of, and expensive mistakes are made, and mistakes that hurt a lot of people, because they never learn to recognize, acknowledge their own weakness at handling culture, and they never learn any tools for handling culture. So I teach a course in culture because I think it's central to managing in a more globalized world, and in a world of coalitions of firms and organizations and nations and professions working together, cross-functional teams doing projects together. You've got to deal with the different professional cultures, gender cultures, organizational cultures there, and then sometimes national cultures there.